What if we did? What if we rocked the world with hope? It's worth a try, don't you think? These are the words of Max Lucado. But we all look for inspiration, and we look for people who will help us to live our lives. And the Bible is given to us, and tells the real stories, the real gritty, difficult stories. Some of them hard to read, But we look, and they give us inspiration. There are incredible people in the Bible. There are some stories that give us warning, and some stories that are there to give us wisdom. And our first story is a very sad one. And it's the first of our three characters that we're going to introduce to you. And it's Stephen the Fearless. He was a Christian. He was a Greek-speaking Jew. Not an apostle, not one of the ones that had been sent out to lead. But he was one of many believers following Jesus. Out of all of the community, 7 were chosen by the apostles to become one of the first church administrators. So the apostles could spend their time preaching and praying, telling everyone about Jesus. And now Hillary's going to come and tell the story of Stephen.
That song that we sang, Stirred by a Passion, Let It Overflow, All for Jesus, that was Stephen. As the apostles went on preaching in Jerusalem, many more became followers of the Jesus way. Everyone was made welcome, and any in need were looked after. But so much of the apostles' time was taken up with caring for everyone that they hadn't time to preach and pray as Jesus had told them to do. So they picked 7 good men to be in charge of sharing out the funds fairly among the widows and others in need. Stephen was one of the 7. He was energetic and enthusiastic and argued with members of the Jewish synagogues very skillfully to prove that Jesus was the Messiah. But he soon made enemies. These people invented false charges against him and brought him before the council. As the charges were read out, Stephen faced his accusers bravely, his face like an angel's, full of goodness and light. Then it was Stephen's turn to speak. All down the ages, our nation has refused to listen to the leaders that God has sent to them. Now you have rejected and murdered God's most important messenger, his son Jesus, said Stephen. The council members were furious. They shook their fists. They shouted angrily at Stephen. His voice rang out again. I can see Jesus in heaven itself, and he is standing at God's side. With a snarl of rage, his accusers flew at him, seized hold of him and dragged him outside the city. They picked up rocks and boulders and began to hurl them at him. As the stones came thick and fast, Stephen sank to his knees. Lord Jesus, receive my spirit, he cried out. And just before he lost consciousness, he prayed, Lord, please forgive them for this crime. And then he fell to the ground dead. A young man called Saul was looking after the cloaks that the council members had hastily thrown down. He fully agreed with what they were doing. Later, some of the believers took Stephen's body so that they could give it a proper burial. The very day that Stephen was stoned to death, a big hunt began for all the followers of Jesus. Saul was the ringleader. He thought that he was pleasing God by trying to get rid of this new teaching about Jesus. He battered on the doors of every house where the people of the way used to meet and dragged them off to prison.
Stephen's faith was so real, his love of Jesus so compelling, that he just had to try and persuade everyone that Jesus was the Messiah. He was overflowing with the good news of Jesus. But his life, and in particular his death, touched someone else that Stephen could never have known about. This person was called Saul, the man who was holding the cloaks. Saul, was known as Paul in his hometown of Tarsus, the Roman version. He spoke Latin and Greek as well as Aramaic, which was the language that Jesus spoke, and probably Hebrew. It must have been Hebrew because he read the Hebrew scriptures. A Roman citizen. He was not a criminal within the Jewish society, but a keen follower of the law, a Pharisee, a very devout, God-fearing man who wanted to please God. Someone who prayed fervently during the day and really believed that he was doing what God wanted. Someone who had never met Jesus. And he was someone who believed that all the followers of Jesus were misguided and should be stopped. So we're going to take it on.
So let's track the story a bit further. One day, Saul, on his mission to find Christians, set out for Damascus with letters from the Jewish council that would give him power to arrest those followers of Jesus in the city and bring them to Jerusalem for trial. Armed guards went with him. They journeyed for about 6 days before the gates of Damascus at last came into sight. Suddenly, the brightness of the noonday seemed to grow pale as a startling flash of brilliance lit up the sky and shone all around. Saul fell to the ground, stunned by the dazzling light. Then a voice spoke to him. "Saul, why are you persecuting me?" Fearing, yet guessing what the answer would be, Saul asked, "Who are you, Lord?" "I'm Jesus," came the reply. "Every time you ill-treat one of my followers, you are ill-treating me." "What do you want me to do, Lord?" All his pride and hatred had gone. "Go into the city, and you will be told what to do next," Jesus said. Saul struggled to his feet, but he could see nothing. He'd been blinded by that light from heaven. The armed guards had seen the light that shone from heaven, but they didn't see the one who spoke to Paul or understand what was said. When they saw Paul stagger to his feet and realized that he was blind, they took his hand and led him to a house in Damascus in Straight Street. Paul stayed there for 3 days, praying and thinking about his vision. He didn't eat or drink. Meanwhile, Jesus spoke to a believer called Ananias, one of his followers in Damascus. "Go to Straight Street," he was told. "Knock on the door of Judas's house and ask to see Saul of Tarsus. He is expecting you." Ananias was horrified. He'd heard all about Saul, but Lord, he protested, Saul is our enemy. He's come on purpose to arrest us. He's become my servant, Jesus reassured him. I've chosen him to take the good news far and wide. Ananias set off obediently. As soon as he saw Saul, he went quickly across to him and put his hands on his shoulders. "Brother Saul," he said kindly, "Jesus himself, who spoke to you, has sent me here so that you may see once more and receive his Holy Spirit." At once, something like fish scales fell from Saul's eyes, and he could see again. Then Ananias baptized him, and he ate a good meal. Paul stayed on in Damascus, not to arrest believers, but to preach about Jesus in all the synagogues there. They were amazed at the change that had come over him. But his own people, who would have once been his friends and allies, became Saul's bitter enemies. They made up their minds to stop his preaching and made a plot to kill him.
It's an amazing story. It's an amazing telling. The change that took place in this man's life. He was going 100 miles an hour in this direction, and suddenly he stopped and he is turned completely around. God took Paul back onto his knees for 3 days. He prayed and fasted during that time and processed what he had heard and seen. Meeting Jesus changed everything for Paul. His career, his fame, his importance within the community that he'd grown up in, his purpose and expectations of what it was that meant a fulfilled life. What about Ananias? He was the little one in this story. He was just minding his own business, and suddenly Jesus comes to him. I wonder how I would have reacted if that had been me, and I knew that somebody who was out to get me was the one that Jesus was sending me to. Would I have obeyed that voice, asking me to go and help the very person that I was hiding from? All the Christians, they feared what was about to happen, and I'm sure they were praying with all their hearts. Ananias argued with the Lord, but he still did what he was asked. Now, I just want to have a look at one or two things about how God was doing this whole thing. Let's just notice that God was watching Saul, who was then called Paul. God was watching him even when he was completely opposed. The next thing is that God had a plan for Saul, from way before. He said, I want him to know how much he's going to do for me. God stopped him from doing what he thought was the right thing and showed him what the real right thing was. And he made him blind for a bit, really just to show him how blind he had been, even though his eyes were open. God used a follower of his to go and speak to Saul and to pray for him. Was that a difficult thing to do? Was it a complicated thing to do? No, it wasn't a complicated thing to do. All he had to go and do was pray for him. And then God did all the rest. Amazing. Now, we might feel like one of the people in the story. It may be that we're afraid. It may be that there's somebody here who identifies with actually really struggling with what God's saying to you at the moment. But actually, God is speaking to us today, and he's already longing to speak to lots of people who are out there who don't even know yet that God is in our community speaking to people now, but they're just waiting for one of us to be the person that goes and prays for them. A simple little word. Some people are utterly convinced that they're doing the right thing, and actually they're not. And I can be that person, and any of us can be that person. And we need to be open in our hearts to what God might say to correct us. Maybe we're resisting something. Maybe we're finding something difficult to really take into our hearts and step into. Maybe we're struggling with our identity. Or, am I here or am I there? Am I in or am I out? And the truth is, we are all dealing with who we are every day. Every day, God is saying, come on, a bit more, come on, trust me, more and more. That's an amazing truth. So we're all working on who we are and how bold and confident we can be in obeying him. That was what Ananias was doing. God was showing Paul who he really was. And the question is God maybe asking one of us, or maybe many of us, or even all of us, to be ready to go and talk and to pray for somebody out there?